This next video will be about Baroque Flanders, or the Spanish Netherlands, and the Dutch Republic. So focusing in on artists like Rubens and Rembrandt and Vermeer, and that will be the focus. So let's start off by looking at Rubens. Let's look at an example of a self-portrait with his family. And he did a number of self-portraits as well as family portraits, and what we see here is Rubens as an older man with his very young second wife and their son. And what we often see here are gardens that are equated with ideas of love, but clearly Rubens is emphasizing his status here. Remember that Velázquez was emphasizing his status in Las Meninas and demonstrating that he hangs out with royalty. He hangs out with the Spanish royal family. Well, Rubens hung out with a lot of royalty. He hung out with a lot of dukes and a lot of kings, and Rubens was really the artist everyone wanted to be. He was able to buy a large house, and he was able to have a huge workshop. He was able to be very, very prolific. He was very successful as an artist, and he was a great favorite of a number of rulers. And so what we see here is not only his kind of successful life in the domestic sphere, but it also reflects a wider success in his life, that he's able to commemorate himself and show himself with such wealth. So Rubens' style tends to be very dramatic, into ideas of beauty. It reflects on ideas that are built on some Italian traditions, but incorporating quite a bit of drama into them. So we know that Rubens had experience with Italian art, examples from Titian, Tintoretto in Venice, so where we see some of these plays of light, the importance of color, the importance of foreshortening, or the ideas of figures kind of going into the picture plane. This is all built on some of the traditions that come from the high and late Renaissance in Italy, but Rubens is definitely adding his own spin to it. For men, he tends to represent them as extremely muscular, sometimes with tan or brownish skin. Women tend to be very pale and very fleshy. We often hear about people referring to a Rubenesque kind of woman, and usually that means like a very curvy, fleshy type of woman. So what we see here is Christ and what's called the elevation of the cross. It's a triptych, a traditional triptych, a large triptych. Today it's in the Antwerp Cathedral, and so what we see here is a cross being raised up. And so rather than just having the generic crucifixion scene, which so many people would have seen before, what Rubens is saying is, let's put it in action. Let's capture this moment where the men are struggling to lift this cross, and let's see the Virgin Mary who's reflecting on this moment, and let's see Christ gazing up to the heavens during this time. So it's a very agitated scene. You have a number of diagonals that cut through the composition, and that's very traditional in the Baroque period. Rather than having a stable pyramidal composition in the Baroque period, we often see diagonals that cut across the composition. So this is a great introduction to Rubens, just in showing the ideas of the drama and the typical representations of men and women, and also the fact that he's building off of some Italian traditions, but of course adding his own contributions. The pendant piece, or really the piece that fits as a pendant to this, and they're both in the Antwerp Cathedral now, is the descent from the cross. So what we see here is the moment after the crucifixion. So again, rather than picking that static moment where Christ is up on the cross, it's the moment where his body is being taken down. So this moment when his body now has lost all of its color, it's almost greenish in color. This is probably building on a tradition of a Mannerist painting from Italy, and what we see here are these punctuations of red that kind of go through the different panels, and we see the body again cutting a dramatic diagonal through the canvas, adding extra drama here. And then on the two sides we see scenes from Christ's early life, the visitation on one side, the presentation of the temple. So this idea that you have these scenes on either side that gives us the early life, and then the end of his life right at the center. As I said, Rubens did a lot of work for royalty. One of his grand commissions was 21 paintings for Marie de Medici and her husband, who was King of France, Henri. And so what we see here is this moment where Marie de Medici, of course arriving from Florence, arriving from Italy, is coming into Marseilles, which is a city in southern France. And what we see here is Marie de Medici, beautifully attired, coming off of her ship. Of course, a ship really couldn't come directly up to a pier at this time. This is really an invented scene that has a lot of added kind of historical and mythological additions and significance. So we see the captain here, we see the Medici coat of arms, the balls represented here. We see Marie coming off her ship with her ladies. We see a figure that represents the country of France with his fleur-de-lis patterned cloak, kind of kneeling down. And then we see figures of the sea, kind of the retinue of Neptune or Poseidon, celebrating her arrival. So you see the fleshy women kind of turning and twisting, and then you see the muscular men kind of pushing the boat into its harbor. So giving the sense that the gods, the mythological gods, have approved of her arrival. So this would have hung in Luxembourg Palace, her palace in Paris, and it was part of a series that, even though she and her husband weren't the greatest of husband and wives, it gives you the sense that from the start they were very blessed, and that their marriage and their union was celebrated by all in many, many ways. It's a large painting, and all these paintings would have fit together into this room, this display. Rubens also used his dramatic style to reflect on the constant wars of the 17th century. What we see here is a scene called The Consequences of War that serves as a great illustration of all of the warfare going on at this time. What we see here functions, again, more symbolically, allegorically. We see here Mars, the god of war. He's charging out to war with a fury figure holding a torch. He's holding onto his sword that's covered in blood, dripping with blood. And we see Venus, his lover, trying to pull him back. That's a really common type of scene where we see Venus trying to pull her lovers back to her. But the pull of warfare is stronger, and we see him crashing out to go and do that, that he's kind of pushing her aside. And we see Cupid, or like a little Eros figure, at the side of his mother, but all her attention is on Mars. We see a figure that represents Europe, who's panicked, who's panicking, who's kind of running around crazed, and then some of the dramatic effects and violent effects of war are illustrated here. So this whole chaotic scene speaks to kind of the pull of war, and then also the disasters of war, and the fact that it is really spreading around Europe. Another example of kind of a violent scene is a representation of the rape or the abduction of the daughters of Leuccipus. And this relates back to a mythological story of two twin brothers who abducted these two women. And what we see here is these two very decisive men, tanned, muscular, grabbing these two women as if they need saving, as if they look confused and they're flailing here. And so what people often interpret this painting as is a reflection of gender attitudes at the time, that men were decisive, they took what they wanted. If they needed women, resources, land, what have you, especially in the case of kings or rulers, they were allowed to do so, whereas women were basically objects to be taken and objects to be controlled. So it definitely speaks to some gender issues. It likely was commissioned at this point when you had the French and Spanish families intermarrying, so there may have been these brothers and sisters that were getting married. So some people have suggested the king and queen, or these to-be kings and queens of Spain and France, as the possible commissioners, or that it was commissioned on this occasion. However, these were young adolescents, teenagers, and so it definitely doesn't reflect them as portraits, but it definitely speaks to larger attitudes of rulers and gender issues at that time. A final work to see is a work of Archduke Leopold, Wilhelm, in his gallery. And these are just interesting works because they function as catalogs of individuals' collections. The Archduke Leopold had an extremely impressive collection, especially of Italian works. We see a lot of works, especially from Venice. And so what we see here is the Archduke being presented his collection by his curators, and these would be wonderful ways to kind of show people in a very condensed form what kind of paintings you had and how many paintings you had. However, these are not really what his rooms looked like. They're hung kind of salon style, one on top of the other, but he definitely did not have a room of this scale. So it's important to realize that these are not realistic. Okay, moving up to the Netherlands, or the Dutch Republic, we're going to see an example of a church, a very simple church that demonstrates the difference, the Westerkerk in Amsterdam, that shows us what a Protestant church would look like at the time. Whitewashed walls, simple stone architecture. There are some similarities with early Florentine architecture by Brunelleschi, kind of the simplistic white or simplistic gray stone. However, at this point, remember, the Baroque in Italy is dramatic. It uses a lot of different colored stones, gilding, marble, lots of visual interest. So there's a clear difference being established here. Here's just a final view that you can see. 5 types of painting in Baroque Europe. In order of importance are history, portrait, genre, landscape, and still life. So it's important to get this order kind of in your head, especially as we move into the period where the academy is dominant and people will be grouped into the academy by the style of painting that they're doing. And so the best painters were those doing the history paintings and the portrait paintings. So an individual that did a number of group portraits was Rembrandt. Rembrandt's most famous for his use of light, which we can clearly see on display here. It has a spotlight effect similar to Caravaggio, but the light's a bit warmer and people often see it as more realistic. What we see here is a dissection, and so human dissection was becoming more common but still was infrequent at this time. Usually it was done more stadium seating style, but here you see the Guild of Surgeons gathered around having a portrait done, an imagined portrait, where they're all doing their trade, this idea of surgery. And so we see Dr. Tulp. Dr. Tulp is the leader here, and all of the men attentively looking at what he's doing. They're referring to notes, they're referring to a book. So clearly these are very learned men, they're all wearing similar garb, except Dr. Tulp's is slightly different, differentiating him from the group. The body's clearly on display, and we're seeing the hand. The hand is an important tool for the surgeon, also for the artist, and also it's a way of showing the complexity of the human body in general. Also, it allows the rest of the body to be on display. Those who were dissected at this time were generally criminals. This man had been convicted of theft, and so that's how he ended up being dissected. Another group portrait, more famous one, is often referred to as the Night Watch, but the more correct title would be the company of Captain Frans and Cocq, where we see him at center with his lieutenant. This is a militia guild, or a group that favors rifles and guns, and so what we see here are men preparing the gun for the first stage, the second stage, and the third stage. We see a man whose gun is actually going off towards the head of the lieutenant, so one often wonders if there's some kind of joke here. The varnish has darkened so much over the years that many people thought it was a night watch, kind of like a neighborhood watch scene, but in reality it's one of these very candid, kind of loose group portraits that would have hung on the wall of a guild hall or a community hall. It's a large painting, and they have done some cleaning on it, removing some of the varnish layers, but it still looks very dark, as Rembrandt's paintings tend to do. So we see that revealed in this painting. This curious figure here is often referred to almost like the mascot of the group, but she has some of the features similar to Saskia, Rembrandt's wife. Rembrandt also did a number of self-portraits that tend to reflect his life, what he was going through at the time. By the end of his life, he faced a great deal of personal and financial trouble, so he tends to look a bit more kind of serious. His painting becomes a bit looser. We still see a beautiful use of light. The big question here is, why are these circles here? And most people think that it's the idea that a good artist can do a perfect circle freehand. So that's a possibility, but we also see him emphasizing his trade. We see him holding on to the tools of being a painter right here. Earlier in his life, he tended to make himself a bit more fancy. We do have a female painter here to focus on. Her name's Judith Leyster, and what we see here is what's called the proposition. The proposition is a young woman who's very dutifully doing her sewing. She's doing her needlework, and that was a sign of a virtuous woman. If a woman's doing her needlework, if she's weaving, if she's sewing, that's a good woman. We see Judith Leyster using some similar light effects as we've seen in Rembrandt or in other Baroque artists of this time who worked in the Baroque realist style. And what we see here is a man, probably a man who's supposed to be a foreigner and out-of-towner, and we have a light here illuminating her needlework, but he's holding out a coin to her. So this is the idea that he's proposing to her, presumably the idea that he's trying to turn her into a prostitute, basically, proposing a night together. But clearly from her expression, from her way of holding herself, she is rejecting him. So Judith Leyster's version is shutting down. Vermeer, however, Jan Vermeer, who's one of the most famous Dutch painters, created a much more kind of friendly, what we might call a merry company scene. This is called the Procuress. What we see here is a figure, maybe Vermeer as a self-portrait, in a jolly scene where a woman is clearly accepting the money. We see the man grabbing onto her breast, we see him looking very disheveled as if he's been drinking, and the woman, presumably the madam, is collecting. This is a relatively kind of crowded scene. A much more effective scene would be Jan Vermeer's Allegory of the Art of Painting, done later in his career, where we see probably him working away in unusual clothing, painting the figure of Clio, who's the muse of history. She has her wreath on her head, she has her book of Thucydides, she has her trumpet, Vermeer was Catholic, and so we see some references to the Habsburgs, we see the Eagles, we see also the divide in the Dutch Republic, but this